These headlines that you see often, I'm sort of a fan of scrolling through internet news sources, and I have a couple of science sources that I regularly look at, and very often there's a headline that says something like, "Doesn't science and religion conflict?" We see these all the time, and it's always irritated me, and I thought, what's wrong with this? There's something wrong with this. And it kind of puts you on the defensive if you're a believer. And I realized they've got it backwards. the question should be, doesn't science and naturalism conflict? And you seem to think that was a cool idea. Pick up on that. What do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting because what it does is it allows the people who recognize that naturalism and science, although they're both connected, that there's a problem, is that if you look at the data, the data will push you to a certain point at which naturalism doesn't make any sense. So there's a conflict intrinsic to it, only if you look at it from outside naturalism, though. And that's why it doesn't appear to be paradoxical to a naturalist. It seems like there's no other way. But do you have to be a Christian to be a person who is not a naturalist?
No.
You don't. So it's any perspective other than a naturalist perspective that allows you to see the paradox of naturalism and science, or the data of science. Science is the interpretation of data, among other things. So that was the first thing that struck me when you mentioned that. I thought, well, that's interesting, because it forces us to realize that there are other perspectives other than Christianity, other than naturalism, that have a voice and have something to say about the question whether naturalism and science are really in tension.
Yes. And the thing that you have to understand if you're discussing this with somebody is that naturalism is a point of view, it's a worldview that's put on before the data comes in. It's a bias. There aren't any good reasons to believe it. It's just how they choose to see the world. And so they're going to take all the evidence for supernaturalism, see it through their naturalistic lens, but the interpretations they will have as they continue to do that seem to get more and more outlandish, wouldn't you think?
It seems like it. And what's also interesting is that I've heard atheists who said that they were not naturalists.
Well, I would say David Berlinski, who you turned me on to, he's a secular Jew. He has a PhD. In reading him, he seems as close to being a Christian as is possible without being one. But he says he is not a Christian, yet he is certainly not a naturalist. He loves to beat those guys up. If you guys want some interesting reading, he's not only really thoughtful and clear-minded, but he's funny and sarcastic and easy to read. David Berlinski, I would suggest him.
Unless you read his stuff about mathematics, in which case it's not easy reading.
Yeah, because he's a mathematician.
Yeah.
So, if you're discussing this with somebody, one of the first things you want to say is, religion cannot conflict because the scientific worldview is based in a Christian worldview. It started by people who believed the Bible and that God is a rational being, and therefore the universe must be rational and intelligible. So the very basis for science in the first place came out of a Christian worldview. And if you listen to John Lennox, another mathematician Christian who's a really, really good guy to listen to, he says, if naturalism were true and we're just the result of blind forces, how is it that we have an intellect that we can trust, that can discern whether there is a God or not? How did that rational ability, that ability to add 2 plus 2, how do you explain that from a naturalistic standpoint? We would just be beasts with no rational ability if evolution was all there was to say about it. So the very fact that we can even ask the question, is there a conflict, is evidence that the conflict is between science and naturalism, not between science and theism.
Yeah, I don't want to extend beyond that. I think you ought to just keep on going with that stream, because I think no, let me just let you continue with that stream, because I don't want to add anything.
I ran out of things to say.
Okay. Well, then let's talk about...
You pick up on it.
All right. Then let's also talk about some of the history of this, because the history of science wasn't exactly the way a lot of people think it was. I mean, it depends on what you want to call the science. So is science the institutionalized social process of extending knowledge through testing and looking at hypotheses and then determining whether the hypotheses are true. If that's science, then that started roughly around the 1700s, maybe the 1600s, because you can get, or actually it was 1600s. So the question wasn't for them what's true in the sense of, a supernatural and natural. They didn't even have that distinction. For them, everything was part of the supernatural. There wasn't really another way of putting it is...
And the Bible doesn't make that distinction.
It doesn't.
Either.
No, it doesn't. It was presumed. It was presumed that everything was created by God, and therefore everything is capable of being interpreted through a mind, the human mind, which is in the image of God. In other words, if God created it all, he imbued it with a certain kind of a logic and a certain kind of capacity to be understood, and gave us the ability to do that. And presuming that, people, the most famous scientists that we can imagine in the history of science, went about doing their business recognizing that they were looking into one of two things: the creation of God or the mind of God.
Thinking God's thoughts after.
That's right, and that's what they were after. So it wasn't until about the 1800s, maybe the 1700s, that the idea of a supernatural and a natural schism actually occurred. So you have the so-called Enlightenment, and I don't know how enlightening it was, but the bottom line is that's the period's name, where people started to try to avoid having a God in the picture.
Right.
Because they looked at the mechanics of the scientific process and said, well, we can explain things without God. So why do we need to bother with even talking about him in anything that we're doing? So that will be the supernatural. That's the stuff that happens outside nature. And then there's the natural, where before that wasn't the way that people thought. So it was an interesting concept that science brought with it, this notion that God is the creator, and then we're learning about God and learning about how God thinks, his nature. And then it also brought in the schism between the sacred and the holy, in the sense of what science can do, it can teach us that God is not involved. When the other ones are saying God most certainly is involved, and we just want to know more about him.
Right. Yeah, this idea that there's the way the universe moves through, and it seems to be following natural laws and is logical, and then all of a sudden God intervenes and does a miracle, and then it goes back to being normal. That's a really wrong-headed way to look at it from a Christian point of view, isn't it?
Yes. And somewhere along the road, the term supernatural probably occurred around the 1800s or 1750s or so, maybe closer to the 1800s. The term supernatural took on a new meaning. And so it took on the meaning of, instead of what it had before that, which is the accumulation of God's creation being supernatural, to only the things that aren't in creation being supernatural, which confused people and still confuses people today, which is why we have the question about science and naturalism and supernaturalism, and can science and religion cohabit the same thought spaces? Can they consider the same things? And so we're living in a world now that's a product of a confusion that we as Christians have a really wonderful opportunity to clear up.
Except a lot of Christians are confused in the same way.
Why are they confused?
Because I think that we naturally pay more attention, Christians in any age at any time naturally pay more attention to the culture around them than the pages of Scripture. It's just easier.
So there's a sort of, would you say that there's a kind of anti-intellectualism?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think that started in the church when, about 100 years ago, when the church had no answer for Darwin. They didn't know how to answer evolution. And instead of studying up and coming up with good arguments, they just kind of bunkered up and said, well, we believe the Bible, we're going to push this whole science thing away from us. And that was a really, really bad move strategically, because it still has rippling effects to this day, where churches don't want to touch apologetics and arguments for God and being on the forefront of science and proclaiming our faith with a scientific worldview rather than pushing it away. You know, that George Lemaitre, that one of Einstein's buddies that helped us figure out the expanding universe, was a Belgian priest and an astronomer. That's what we should be doing now, is people like that, and there's lots of them.
Yes. The thing that happened, though, I think in the 1800s, and I'm not an expert on the history of the church, but I remember that in the 1800s, and if there's somebody in here who knows more about it, please speak up. But in the 1800s, particularly in the middle and in the latter end of the 1800s, there were movements in England, particularly England, and then also in the United States, towards a much more emotional faith.
Yes.
And so you had these emotion-laden revivals.
And it was about experience.
Very much an
Revelation.
Experience, yes. And so the idea that you could come to the Lord in other ways other than just through your emotions became a foreign notion.
Yes.
So you had people who were good preachers who were preaching the Word of God and inviting people to come to Christ on an almost exclusively emotional basis. Now, they were able to succeed there because the culture at the time was well steeped in Christianity. They knew, if they didn't know the Bible directly, they knew about it, they knew its terms, they knew the larger doctrines. And even if they didn't believe it, they at least knew it. So they were walking into, these pastors were walking into a culture where non-believers still knew what they were talking about when they talked to them about hell and Jesus and those kinds of things. So this is occurring at the same time where the post-Enlightenment rush is coming up, a rush to intellectualism, and to intellectualize all of the kinds of things that can be explained.
Which was a good thing, because it had gone too far into the emotional side.
Yes. So you see this interesting problem that we're now living the consequences of. Now, this has gone up and down. It hasn't been just a linear process. But one of the things that occurred is that as Christianity, Western Christianity, I'm not talking about the Christianity that moved into the Far East and the Near East, or down into Africa, but the Western Christianity that we inherited from England particularly, became more into the quick and emotional responses, which have their benefits of having people love the Lord fully and understand that love, and also be terrified of hell because they knew about it, and a lot of those preachers talked about hell, which we wish they would do now too sometimes. So Christianity inherits this kind of, Western Christianity inherits this kind of emotional Christianity and loses touch with the fact that the rest of the culture is walking away from that and walking into a scientistic culture. A scientistic culture means that we're going to hold it, that science has all the answers, that we really don't need to have a Christian answer for anything.
Right.
And now we have that fully divided, although we have the benefit now of about 50 or 60 years of a renaissance of Christian thought, starting with maybe C.S. Lewis and going forward from him, although there would be a good argument that there were others. So what does that mean? Why should anybody care about any of this history? Well, it's important for us to understand why it is that there's even the question of supernatural versus natural, and why it is that anyone would think that there's a separation between the facts of science and the Word of God. And we have to recapitulate that. We have to make sure that when we're talking to somebody, we have the sophistication to explain that to them. We don't have to go to all the history, but we do have to explain to them that you can have your mind fully active and understand all of the elements of science and still understand that shows the existence of God that doesn't repel the belief in the existence of God.
And I think that balance is really important. The history of the church has been a history of going back and forth from an emotional revelation-based faith and then towards a more rational faith, but we've gone too far with that. During the founding of our country, many of our founders didn't believe in revelation. They believed that our faith in God was solely based on rationality. And you still find people like that now. And finding that balance between truth and the more emotive, feeling, revelatory side of the faith is a fight that we all have. I know me personally, I'm such an analytical person, and I basically go at everything as if it was an engineering or a math problem. And as I've gotten older, and I've really wanted to be more in touch with the loving, caring, compassionate, revelatory side of the faith. That's been my personal goal.
Are there different ways that we come to our faith? In other words, you can't really know about Christ without knowing the Bible, because that's where Jesus is expressed.
Right.
So there is a story to be told, and that story is uttered in propositions. In one form, it's propositions. This happened. Okay?
Right.
So this is true or false. This happened. Then it's also presented to us, when we read Romans 1:20, we're told that we're accountable to knowing God and his eternal nature and his character by what? By what? What is it? How are we supposed to know that? How are we held accountable for that? And look it up in Romans 1:20. If you've forgotten it, then look it up.
Just by the facts of nature, by what we see.
By creation. He says you are accountable to look at creation, and they're convicted by that, for they can see the eternal nature of God and his character. So that's another way that we know God. We know God through the propositions of the Bible. We know God through the revelation of nature. But then when you go into the Bible does it in more than just in strict propositions. So you have doctrines, that Jesus rose from the dead. That's a proposition. There's not any question about that. But then you have stories. What about the parables of Jesus? He wasn't uttering doctrines. He was doing something else.
And you certainly can't make a rational list out of the
No.
lessons from the parables.
No, so Jesus is presenting himself as a revelation. And he's presenting these different accounts and stories to bring people to recognize who he is.
Right. He even says, if you want to know who God is, look at what I do.
Yes.
Because this is God speaking. This in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Colossians 2:9 says that. You look at Jesus, you see God.
Yes. And so we have that revelation as well. And then do we have any other revelations? Is there any other way, other than the propositions of the Bible, the stories that are given, the explanations of Christ and creation that tell us that God exists and that we have relationship with him? Please.
There was about this one man was on the bed. He couldn't even walk at all. It was way back. This is way back. And this man couldn't even walk. There was some other men were carrying him to the town where Jesus was.
Yeah.
So that was a miracle. In other words, they brought him to Jesus and
Yes.
he healed him.
And yes, that's right.
Thank
And
you.
it was a miracle. And he sold everything, and he became one of the saints.
Well, the idea that Jesus performed miracles and that miracles occurred during Jesus' time.
That was back 200 years ago.
It was 2,000 years ago. Yeah, that was a long time ago.
I know.
That is another way that we get revelation from God, as we get to see the miracles. Do we have a revelation from God from our own experiences? So how many different ways of knowing God have I talked about so far? I'll give you a hint. It starts with 4 and ends with +1. Okay, so 5. Good, thank you. You had your hand up with five different.
Spiritual revelation.
And what is that?
That is when we sit there and we tune ourselves to God and hear His will for us and see His will through His Word and through His works, and we spiritually realize within our heart, this is God.
Thank you. So our own experiences with God, that's the spiritual experiences. Thank you.
And another one is meditating too.
Meditation?
Yes.
And what is meditation?
You pray to God a lot. You pray to God.
That's good.
Thank you. We are back here.
Dan?
Yeah. Yes, the Bible is our source of truth. Jesus himself said, nobody knows the Son but the Father, and nobody knows the Father but the Son. Matthew 11:27 and Luke 10:22. That means you have to know the Bible through Christ, and He reveals the Father to you. That's the only way you can say, you can maybe say, oh, well, I can think about God. But it has to be based on the Bible. And Jesus said, He can reveal the Father. It actually says, whosoever. So that doesn't mean everybody will know, but whosoever He reveals the Father to.
Although, Dan, I think that I want to take you up on that a little bit. I think sometimes God can reveal Himself directly to people to get them started. I know my father has passed away, but he told the story. He was converted. He became a Christian by himself because God talked to him and said, Christianity is true. I am God. Go figure it out. And he took that. He had an encounter with God directly on it. He was alone.
Yes, the Bible.
So that can get you started. And then what happens, Dan, if I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here with what you're saying. What if somebody in a tribe in New Guinea that's never heard of Christ and doesn't have the Bible, what if someone in that tribe has an encounter with God?
Well, it just so happened there's another verse in the Bible that says God draws you first.
God what?
Draws you.
Right.
See?
But what if they're in a culture that doesn't have the Bible at all?
That's right.
Can they still
Yes, because
get to know Him?
God can draw you too.
I
to
agree.
it. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. Okay.
Do we take up the next one?
Yeah. So a couple of weeks ago, we came up with this, Mark and I came up with this list of reasons that scientists will tell you that they believe in naturalism. And we worked on, I'll go back, we worked on three of them. We can't do science in a supernatural world. Naturalism must be assumed. We beat that up. If you take science seriously, it automatically leads to naturalism. We killed that one with a sword, as I recall. Natural science is the most reliable way to learn about the world, therefore naturalism must be true. That's logically not true. And I told you we'd have a really good one next, and this is it. Believing in supernaturalism is the same as believing in magic. Now, if you are a Christian having a conversation with somebody who is a naturalist, and they tell you this, it's pretty, it would put you on the defensive pretty quick. It's kind of antagonistic. How would you respond to that?
Yep, Steve back there.
You know, I'm just wondering, as far as this goes, I've thought about this, and, you know, I'm wondering what you guys think about it, because I'm thinking that, you know, as science progresses and as we get more and more, you know, a greater understanding of the natural world and how to use it, and medical science and, you know, transhumanism, Fuzz just put out that book and talks about all the incredible, you know, medical advances in science and everything, and we're more and more able to manipulate the natural world, and we're gaining better and better command of the natural world in some sense through science, right? We can do things that would have seemed like miracles in ancient times. And God, in some sense, we believe, has the absolute mastery of the universe because He created it. He knows all the all the configuration
Right.
parameters. He knows how to do everything immediately. Stuff that would take us thousands of years to learn through research, he can do immediately. He knows how to do that. So, when we say supernaturalism and magic and all that, is it just God manipulating the universe because he has complete mastery of it? Isn't that what it is? It seems to me like that's what it is. I mean, when the resurrection took place, when any miracle in the Bible happened, God was intervening and doing something. But something was happening. It wasn't just some magic thing. If you could be there and see it, something was actually happening. Some process was doing something. So it seems to me like it's something that could be discovered, but really it would take us thousands of years, or we could never discover it because it's too complicated. Yet God is capable of it. So this idea that we eventually, through science and everything, can look now like, in the ancient times, we can look like we're supernatural or we're gods, but we're really not. We're just gaining more understanding of the natural world. Is that a way that you could argue this point? Like, God is just a being that's so superior to us that he has control of the natural world and he can do these things. And we believe that. We believe that there is a being who can do that. But it's not magic. It's not just some thing that you could never gain understanding of. If you were there to witness it and you could put probes on it, maybe you could figure it out. Maybe you would get some understanding of how it works.
So if you could
that whole idea, is that an argument here?
So you're saying if you could see deep enough into the process, if you were there and watched it happen,
You might be able to
could
get,
see some cause
yeah,
and
some
effect.
of these things God used in the past might, but there's he's set things up ahead of time too. He has so much knowledge that he can configure the weather to react the way he wants hundreds of years or, way ahead of time. Like when there was a storm, like the Genesis flood, there was a storm, there was rain. Did he just immediately make that happen right then? Maybe he did, or maybe he set it up ahead of time. It's stuff we can do too, but it's so beyond our ability that it's amazing and it's a miracle. But it's not magic. It's not just some unknown, it's something that does happen and is discoverable if you had the right. So, I don't know if that's an argument though, because I know with revelation, believing in Jesus, that is a miracle. That to me, to believe and to follow him, that's a miraculous process. To actually, turn against your sin and choose God is to me the ultimate miracle, to actually change your mind and your heart and follow him. There's no way we can, scientifically measure that. That is beyond our. So anyway, those are just some ideas.
Good.
I don't know what you guys think of that.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, you got a comment on that?
If we look at the term magic to mean the manipulation of reality by the magician in a mysterious way,
And slightly evil way.
or, well, it could be evil, it could be not evil. Not all magicians throughout history have done things to do it just to be evil, but certainly there are a certain amount of that. But so let's use that as a definition. We'll just be morally neutral about it, recognizing that that's what the definition is. So here's the essence of it. If the essence is that there's a magician operating on reality to alter it in some respect for his own gain, is that the same thing as the argument that something outside of nature exists? It's not.
No.
No, it isn't. So first of all, just logically and philosophically, the argument doesn't work, just on the definitions. And I'm not using an arcane or weird definition. I think everybody would agree that that's the definition of magic, its intentions, and what the supernatural means. So this argument that believing in supernaturalism is the same as believing in magic is false on its face. Next, if magic, they're using the term magic to mean that it's something impossible, then they're right, because then the magic is doing something impossible, and that's what we're saying about supernaturalism. At least that's what they're saying. But that's not really what's going on here, so I want to discard that option also. So we're going to play this philosophical game and parse this piece by piece. Last, if what they're saying by magic is they're going to do something mysterious by a power that the magician has that nobody else has, now I'd like to flip this back on the scientist. And I'd like to say, okay, if the things that are being done that are called magic, that are mysterious, are done by a magician that has some kind of magical powers, how is that any different from an explanation about, let's say, the origin of life? Because you can say, well, the origin of life is certainly a natural event. And I would come back, how is that any different from magic? You don't know. You don't know. You have zero evidence. How is it that you're looking at that creation event? How is that any more than your claim of natural creation? How is that any more or any less mysterious than divine creation? You're just sticking your own hopeful, wishful thinking on this mystery. You're believing that some power that a magician can have, some scientist can have in the future, to be able to create life from nothing exists. And you're superimposing that backwards. How is that? It doesn't work. You're not doing anything better by claiming that supernaturalism is like magic any more than we would be doing it by saying science is like magic.
Yeah, I love that, Mark. That's great, because you could flip this around and just say believing in naturalism is the same as believing in magic. Because origin of life, origin of consciousness, origin of humanity, origin of the universe, origin of morality, those things just magically appeared from a naturalistic standpoint?
Well, you'd have to be careful about saying that naturalism is like magic, because it's not entirely like magic. It's naturalism means we're looking at natural causes for natural events. But you have a problem there in exactly those areas you described. In origins, particularly, aboriginal absolute origins, something that has nothing come before it, something original. The original life, original universe, original mind, those are mysteries. How do those happen? So that's a scientific question. How did that happen? That's exactly what scientists want to know. How did that happen? How do these natural events occur, and we want to have them known by a natural explanation? Perfectly reasonable thing to ask. You can't operate your life without asking that question. How did this happen, and how did it happen naturally? Although, there are some things, for example, when we look in the scriptures and see Jesus rising from the dead, we have to ask ourselves, how did that happen? And no, we'll never know. We don't know how God raises people from the dead. So we do now have a different character of the supernatural that science doesn't ever deal with. And so now they're looking at that and saying, well, see, that's just like magic.
Yeah.
This guy just he got killed, but then he made himself alive again. That's just like magic. That doesn't even make any sense. That's a big mystery. That doesn't make any sense. Of course it doesn't make sense, and that's exactly why it was done.
That's right. We have a bunch of comments. We'll do the guy with the mic first.
Yeah, it's like, I think science gets itself mixed up with magic, because to me, the definition of magic is that a human does a trick. It's not a miracle, never has been. No magician has ever done anything that's been a miracle. It's all a trick. And I think science is trying to look at creation. Okay, what kind of trick was done here? Because they can't accept a miracle. They can't accept because they can't explain it, and they're scientists, and we want to explain it. But you're not God, so you can't explain it. You don't know how it came about. You can't explain yourself how you came about. And that's what I think frustrates them, is that they're looking for some magical solution, which is trickery, which God does not do trickery, only we do. So I think it's that thing where scientists can't get over that hump of looking at things instead of being a miraculous creation of God, which can't be explained right now. It will be explained. And He will reveal all to us. And the magic that humans do to try and trick people into thinking, wow, that's a miracle. No, sorry, it's not.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When you look at the other side of the coin, you look into the occult, voodoo, all kinds of evil, and we have History Channel that shows haunted houses, and so there's all kinds of what we would call evil, supernatural things going on that science cannot explain. So if that exists, then why not on the side of God, there must be things that we can't, it's unexplainable.
Peter?
Well, with the origin of life or the origin of consciousness, you don't necessarily have an artifact left of supernatural process acting. But when our Lord came out of the tomb, He did leave a physical artifact of a supernatural process acting. If you study what they've gotten out of intensive study, and it's kind of amazing to me because it took several decades for this data research to come out after, I think it was in the 70s or the 80s that they did that intensive study of the Shroud of Turin. And they took all the photograph and image study of that image. And that image is only on surface fibers of that linen cloth. And the coloration is due to exposure to radiation. And the only physical explanation of that evidence left on that piece of cloth is that the radiation that left the image in the fibers had to have been at an extreme high power level and an extremely narrowly focused wavelength of radiation in that instantaneous flash onto the cloth to create that image. And so that's what they know about the image. It's only on the surface of that cloth. It's only on individual fibers at the very surface of the cords of the fabric. And that the radiation can be gleaned by extreme excitation of the DNA molecule. That's the wavelength that went at. So that's not a natural action through a body to create that image. But it also was an image that had to have been shone onto the cloth front and back, with the cloth about the same distance from the source of the radiation. Front and back, which means that the body inside the cloth had to have been lifted up off the bench in the tomb at the instant the image was created. So that's a physical evidence of a supernatural event, and it can't be denied. So it's not the same as magic, because magic is fooling your eye to think you see something that you didn't really see.
But why could that not be denied? Why could a scientist not look at that and say, I think your scientific inference that it had to come only from this particular wavelength or something be disputed?
How?
I don't know how. I'm not the kind of scientist who could do
Well,
that.
see, that's the point. How did somebody levitate the body in the first century? Because the evidence on the shroud, the carbon dating has already been thrown out. Most people don't know that. But the carbon dating was taken from a corner of the cloth that was actually a sewn-in repair of the fabric in the Middle Ages. And that's where they took their sampling. So of course that's Middle-Age fabric, dudes.
Well, even if that's true, let's say everything you say is true. And we look at that, and the naturalist looks at that, or let's say the atheist naturalist / scientist looks at it and says, so what?
Well, that's denial.
But no.
And so if you
but
box somebody to denial, Mark, yes.
No,
They
that's
can
not
go to
denial.
denial.
That's a request to understand the meaning of what you're saying. So if you're going to say that there was a supernatural event that created the image on the Shroud of Turin, do I understand it correctly that that's what you're asserting?
Yes.
Yes, all right.
That supernatural acts through something that you can get a physical record of, but you don't have a natural mechanism by which a body has energy flow through it that excites the DNA molecules of such high intensity of energy and specific wavelength to imprint that image. Plus, natural explanations cannot do levitation.
You're still not answering the question. The question that I would ask if I were a naturalist scientist is, let's just presume you're right. We'll give you that. Now what? What does that mean? Does that mean there's a God, or does that just mean there was some supernatural event? If there was a supernatural event, all right. We don't know about that. You don't know about that. Now what? So what? Who cares? So, and I don't mean that to you. I mean, what I'm getting at is that if I were a supernatural scientist, I would say, all right, you've given us an explanation. Maybe I'll buy it for today. Maybe tomorrow we'll explain it some other way. But well, who cares about the Shroud of Turin? That doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean anything to me as a naturalist. And so I would say, if we're going to look for evidence for a collective case or an accumulative case for God, it's got to be evidence for something that matters. And the Shroud of Turin is so wrapped up in scientific as well as biblical controversy that even if you come to a conclusion that all of the evidence shows is correct, it will only tell us that there was some image imprinted on that we can't explain.
But you just mentioned, I'll take his side on this.
Go.
You just mentioned that it's a cumulative case, and there's often not one piece that is the nail in the coffin. It's 50 pieces that together nail the coffin. Mm-hmm. And I would say, from a Christian standpoint, if the Bible is true, which is what we are defending, this is one additional piece which tends to lend evidence towards the hypothesis that the Bible is true. Mr. Scientist.
Well, my response to that would be another one of those, please show me how the Shroud of Turin, which is, if I'm still going to grant these scientific findings, that these scientific findings suggest that a body went through this thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I buy that, but I'm going to buy it just for the sake of argument here.
Okay.
Then that doesn't suggest that it was Jesus. It doesn't tell me it was Jesus. It could have been some other dude.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't. Jesus didn't sign it. There's no inscription Jesus was here. There's nothing there that says that was Jesus. So
okay.
So if you're gonna try and get me to buy that was the thing that was wrapped around Jesus, even though that was taken out of there according to your own Bible. I mean, they took it out and looked at this stuff. How it ends up showing up thousands of years later, hundreds of years later, I guess that's its own forensic problem. But that could be somebody else's shroud. What if it's one of the other apostles or somebody else or somebody who doesn't have anything to do? What if it's Muhammad's shroud or something? You know, why would I have to buy Jesus? Okay. Well, let's go with Steve.
Yeah, as far as the shroud, isn't it sort of in the same, maybe in some ways in the same category as the Ark, the Noah's Ark, where, you know, people are finding pieces of wood and, oh wow, on Mount Ararat or whatever, and it's disputed. It's not something that's you can establish well, you know, that the shroud is actually really was Jesus. It's just, it seems kind of fuzzy to me. I mean, Noah's, you know, young Earth creationists versus old Earth creationists don't really believe that you can find Noah's Ark because it landed on some hill and then people used the timbers a long time ago and there's nothing left. But people find timbers and say, oh, this is evidence of the Bible because there's this timber on Mount Ararat or whatever. But it's a very weak case. It seems to me like the shroud is kind of in the same category, not really on good standing as far as we really think this is what covered Jesus' body? Is that true?
Well, that's, my argument would be, if I were the scientist, I would say, even if what you have is true, it's an attenuated argument. In other words, it's so far removed from your cumulative case that its relevance is dubious. I don't even buy into that your claim, if true, is even relevant to the entire account. So, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
We have
Dan's first.
Yes, I went to see that exhibit they had on Long Beach when the turret came by. And according to the Bible, this event contradicts the Bible. The turret shows an image of a guy with blood, and if I remember, even there's a crown of thorns still in it, or a picture of it. And on John, imagine when they brought Christ down from the cross, they just took him down and put a linen on his head. I mean, logically, you're going to wipe him out, clean him up. And the Bible says that when he resurrected, that linen was, the one that goes on your head was folded neatly on the side. So I pointed out this to this guy that was having that exhibit, and he says, I'll talk to you later. He never did.
All right, thanks, Dan. I want to hear from Val. And then I want to go on to something else.
Well, we have one more.
Oh, okay.
A new point.
Well, first of all, they'd have to do some testing to prove one way or the other about the shroud. And they'd have to test the original fabric, not the patch. They'd have to test if that's blood and if they could get a DNA-worthy sample, and they have some proof of lineage on this. So. But I mean, the blood itself has to be tested.
No, even if they find the blood, we haven't got a DNA check on Jesus. So what are you going to compare it with? we don't have blood DNA on anybody from back then. So we have Hope had a question. Did you? I think the microphone's coming up.
Thanks. I'm going to bring this down a from and we're going to talk about pumpkins.
Thank you.
This
the
is
big
from,
pumpkin?
Yeah,
Yeah,
this
okay.
is from G.K. Chesterton. I'm just throwing it out to you guys. All the other scientific expressions you are in the habit of using at breakfast are words and winds. You say it is a law of nature that pumpkins should remain pumpkins. That only means that pumpkins generally do remain pumpkins, which is obvious. It does not say why. You say experience is against it. That only means I've not known many pumpkins intimately, and none of them turned into coaches. So I love this because it's telling us you guys are taking some things for granted here. Everyday things that we call natural, really, going back to your original point, there's that artificial divide between natural and supernatural. That's where he's going with this. There's a lot more to it, but...
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Of all the people who quote G.K. Chesterton as one of the best.
yeah. You want to go to the next one, Mark?
I don't know, have we exhausted this? We're done with the Shroud of Turin, because that controversy is not going to end here.
I have a question, or actually a
ahead.
comment. All the ancient cultures talked about having magicians in their court.
Had what?
Had magicians in their courts.
Magicians. Okay.
Magicians, yes, plural. Nebuchadnezzar had his. We know the two magicians in the court of Pharaoh actually pulled off a stunt of turning their staff into a snake and what have you. And it seems like their view of magicians and ours is different. I mean, ours view of magicians is, sleight of hand and an expensive dinner at the Magic Castle. And that's kind of how we think of it here. It seems like in the ancient cultures, there was a lot of belief in this stuff.
Well, there was supernatural activity with some of the magicians in the old courts. I mean, they tried to replicate, and actually did in some cases, replicate things that God did. That was their whole motive. And the demons do that. We know that they have the power to do that. But in the end, the magicians were suppressed because God did things that they couldn't do and solved the problem.
Yeah, they lost. They went up a better
Yeah, they
person.
lost because they weren't powerful enough to do anything about it. But so that might be an example of what the scientists are talking about, because they're scientists who are hostile to Christianity, particularly atheists, the strong atheists are hostile to Christianity. Well, look at those accounts of the magicians with the same skepticism or disbelief that they will hold to the resurrection of Christ. And so you're right that's a different definition from sleight of hand, but even that definition is comprehended in what I said up front, which is that they do something to alter reality to the benefit of the magician by whatever power they do it. So we just don't know. It could be just purely a trick, or it could actually be access to the supernatural world through the demons. So you're absolutely right. There really was real magic that did real things in the Bible and elsewhere. I mean, look at all of the different kinds of places all over the world where voodoo and these other things where people are calling on demons to do things that appear to violate the laws of nature.
And the Bible's pretty clear that we're supposed to, as believers, stay away from that stuff.
Yes.
There is a power there implied in that. If it was harmless or stupid or untrue, God wouldn't have bothered with telling us to stay away from it. But some of that stuff really does happen through the name of Satan by his power, and we are to not play around with that.
It's limited.
Right.
It's also part of the reason that we're told to leave it alone is it's not God we're calling on, it's somebody else, it's idolatry.
Right.
And then the other part of it is that because we have a corrupted nature, to use some kind of supernatural power in our world to do what we think is good is bound to be a failure. It's going to hurt people more than our natural powers would hurt.
And it hurts us more.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Good. Thank you. Next one. There are no rational or scientific reasons for believing in supernaturalism.
Okay, group. You've been coming to Paradoxes class for how many years? Are there no scientific reasons for believing in supernaturalism? Okay, we have one.
John?
Well, if science had documented and proven the ultimate extent of all reality in a very coherent, consistent, complete way, that might be possible. But as it is, there's a vast degree of unknowns: the origin, the extent of the cosmos, the origin, the implications of quantum theory. Some speculate there are multiple universes. So there's no reason to deny the possibility that there's a hyperdimensional realm or some transcendent realm in which the rules operate differently. And this is, there's some parapsychologists that indicate that people are able to perceive things outside of the present time. And they have reasonable documentation for these phenomena. They're hard to explain by any naturalistic, well, what would be called naturalistic. So there is some evidence that the nature of consciousness in particular may be quite different. In fact, many neurologists are beginning to say they believe that consciousness is not an emergent property of the brain, that it's something separate. And indeed, I believe with the biblical view that when the body ceases to function, the consciousness remains functional, and it just has a different realm of experience.
Thank you. So friends, there's got to be a rational reason for believing in supernaturalism. Just come up with one. Steve, we have Mike's coming to you.
A big one that Hugh's been talking about and has books out is the rare earth hypothesis and just how that.
Can you say a little louder? I think.
Yeah, the rare earth hypothesis, just Improbable Planet, his book, and then there's a secular book called Rare Earth. So just this idea that everything's been the amount of parameters required for human life to be possible is just growing, and it's astounding, it's, very improbable that, we could have gotten here naturally. So that's at least one of the arguments.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. That's exactly what we were looking for. Remember, we're not asking for, quote, an absolute proof that God exists or supernaturalism exists. What we're asking for is there a reason, a scientific reason, for believing in supernaturalism. That's one really good reason, is that, and remember that when we talk about reasons, we're talking about inferences from facts. And so the inferences that Steve's talking about is we can infer from the facts of all this fine tuning and the fact that our Earth is unfathomably perfectly ordered and set up in a way that we haven't been able to find anywhere else, and we're not sure that even as big as the universe is, it could even be set up this way. And that our Earth not only can house us, but can house us at a time and in a place perfectly suited for the redemption of humanity. That is a perfectly rational reason to believe in the supernatural. That all of this corresponds to a much broader worldview that Christianity brings to this whole question. And so one of the things that we need to do is realize that when we have our reasons embedded in a bigger worldview that's coherent and that has a lot more to say. I would argue that if someone were to say, well, there's no rational or scientific reasons for believing in supernaturalism, I would say, well, there's a lot of rational reasons for it. Let's start there before I even get into any scientific reasons. And then we'll talk about your scientific reasons, because they're based on, you can't have scientific reasons without rationality. Please, Peter.
It's very connected to that, but it's from the other side's statements. The whole multiverse theory, if you ask somebody to think carefully about it, is an admission of the fine-tuning discoveries that we are so improbable to be here that the numbers are staggering of why are we here, because this chain of improbable events had to happen for us to be here talking about it. And so that's the reason that there is a multiverse theory among materialists, is that's a tacit admission that what we've discovered is the fine-tuning being so extreme and almost unfathomably extreme by the numbers. And if you think about the implications of the universe being fine-tuned, and your immediate response is to abandon science and go into the multiverse theory, because that is an abandonment of science, and it's just a realm of pure belief, because there's no testing of that, ergo no science, sorry.
Yeah, it's a move from physics to metaphysics.
Right.
Yes.
And so the fact that in order to continue your scientific stand, you jumped into metaphysics, well, you've already done it, so why don't you just release it already?
It's kind of like the many worlds interpretation in quantum mechanics. It's the only way to explain it, but there's no evidence for it.
Yeah, and I think where Peter's going is that it's an admission that the fine-tuning is so difficult to explain that you need an infinity of other universes to claim that ours fit in that number. That the only way to get a universe like ours is to have an infinitude of other universes of which we're one. So, yes, they had to jump into metaphysics.
It's kind of like saying aliens must have seeded life on Earth. It's the same kind of thing. It's just an explanation. It's just as, with no basis in there's no evidence for it.
And it is exactly what Peter said, is that it's an admission that the other explanations fail.
Yes, it is.
It's a desperate.
Yeah, that's a really good observation.
Yeah, it's a desperate attempt to cover with what appears to be on its face a plausible case. But I don't see how it's plausible. All you've done is just push the argument back to another mystery. Okay, if the aliens came here and seeded the Earth with life, where did those aliens come from? And where did they start?
Right.
You haven't done anything other than just create another step in the chain. So why don't we just stop here and just say, okay, let's ask how origins begin to start with, especially ones as unfathomably difficult as the one you're up against.
Yeah. I want to say to this that this is a really good example of a bias going into the argument, a worldview going in. Of course, there are no rational reasons for believing in supernaturalism if you assume naturalism at the top. If you say the universe is naturalistic, everything can be explained naturalistically, then you are going to see everything that looks like supernaturalism through a naturalistic lens and start having more and more outlandish explanations for what we see. So what I would say to somebody who says that is, let's get rid of that bias. Let's just look at the facts. Look at the data. Origin of life's a great example. Origin of life on this planet.
Or the year when it was made.
Good. Origin of life. What do we see? We see that 3.5 billion years ago, from a prebiotic environment, which is basically mud and chemistry, this amazing thing called life came into existence. Now, without your anti-supernaturalism bias, what's the best explanation for that? Just look at the data. Doesn't it look and resemble a whole lot more like something that is designed purposefully by a builder with intelligence and power than a random process that could build that? So get rid of the bias off the top. That's how I would argue this.
That's interesting because it was an atheist who I was listening to who was saying that he could see a purpose in evolution. He said the progression appears to be purposeful. And he says, I don't quite know how the purpose works, but he says there's an obvious design to all of this. And he says, I'm an atheist because I haven't been convinced that there is a God. But he said, I cannot ignore the reality of the appearance of purpose and the appearance of design, both of which perplex me and make me ask questions.
Wow.
So here you have somebody who is actually stepping outside the naturalist position and saying, Dawkins is wrong. Dawkins is wrong when he says the appearance of design is an illusion. He says the appearance of this other atheist said the appearance of design is absolutely there. He says there is no way you can be a biologist and not see the design in small systems like cells and large systems like ecosystems. And he says it also drives towards an end. It seems like it's going somewhere. And he says it's hard to not see a purpose in this. This is an atheist talking.
Wow.
So you can actually see purpose and design without having a naturalist position. And I think that's one of the things that we can commend ourselves to doing with naturalists and say, all right, let's just recognize that there are other people who think the same way you do, who are naturalists, who also see design. And let's just ask, what does that imply? What else, what other things does it imply?
Where do you want to go with that?
Yeah, I'm not going to hit you over the head with my Bible. I'm just going to ask you some questions. Let's just talk this through and look at them from different perspectives. And we as Christians need to look at theirs too, by the way, because theirs is not irrational. Theirs is not irrational.
Art, and then Pete over there.
I was thinking of the origin of life investigations. I keep remembering a conference in Cancun, Mexico. It was probably 25 years ago. Stephen Gould was moderating. He got up at the end of the conference and he said, well, all the evidence is against us for evolution, but we know that evolution must be true. There's a very positive belief. And therefore, it is explained by directed panspermia, which in essence means that once upon a time in a star system far, far away, an ancient civilization sent a spacecraft that targeted the Earth with biotic material, which aligns more closely with a creating God than it does with any naturalistic explanation. Also, the more recent researchers in Origin of Life often comment that there just seems to be the evidence or apparently an intervention of an intelligent agent that explains the results.
Thank you, John.
Everyone over here on the right?
Well, Peter was next, and then we'll go to Jim.
I don't know if I'm jumping to the humanities, if I'm going to say that history is at least equivalent to sciences in inquiry.
It could be a forensic case, yeah.
Because there are kind of competing narratives, but I would say three cases that are commonly referred to in terms of considering history and whether the Bible accounts are true. One is the historicity and the witness testament of Jesus's life and ministry. And you cannot actually throw out the Bible as an ancient text any more than you could throw out any of the other historians who give us the existence of Nero. You can't, if you're being consistent in application of ancient documents to know history. So the life of Jesus is historical. He's not a great teacher in that history. He is who he says he is in that history. And it's by witness outside the Bible that you can put together all of the central claims of Christianity. They come to us through Roman and Greek historians that are contemporary. So we can't really throw out the historicity of Jesus. You can't do that. Then the other cases that go negative, that are rampant, are, Hugh's whole life of proving that Genesis is actually valid and true. And the other one that people attack commonly is Exodus. And not a lot of knowledge is out there yet of the counter case for Exodus, that actually Exodus has some historical and archaeological evidence that strongly supports the narrative in the Bible.
Thank you. Tim, you still have something you want? Okay, let's bring that over there. And that'll be our last question.
You got to jog over to the other side of the room.
Okay, one thing that always kind of grates on me is calling this multiverse theory a theory. It is not a theory. No rational science would call it a theory, because a theory is a well-corroborated hypothesis, and there is no corroboration at all. And so that minor correction is something to be thinking about and not go down the path of allowing it to be called a theory. The other point I was going to make is that a lot of these processes that we see as being, that scientists are trying to prove naturalistic explanations for, as we learn more and more, we're getting further and further away. Like the origin of life is something that we are further from a solution than we were 50 years ago or 70 years ago on that. And again, using the scientific method, when you have a hypothesis you're working on that diverges from a solution rather than converging on a solution, then that's good evidence that that is not a valid hypothesis. You need to go somewhere else.
Thank you.
Mark, I think it's time to wrap up.
Okay, then I think, should we pray and let him release?
You want to do that? Or?
I'll be happy to, yeah.
Thank you.
Lord, thank you for letting us be here today. You covered a lot of different things, Lord, and we pray that some of this will get through to some of us so that we can at least think, when we're talking to somebody who doesn't agree with us, that there are different ways of approaching these problems. That those who think in the so-called sciences, who don't really believe us because they think we're not being scientific, can understand the gospel in ways that we would otherwise not do it if we didn't hear these things. Please help us to understand them, help us to process them, and to work through these things that are sometimes very difficult. Speak with each other and be open-minded and open-hearted. And more than anything, Lord, be open to those who are lost and realize that we were once there too. We thank you, Lord, for your love, and we ask that we bring that to other people. Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Since I was late for any class next week?
Yes, you will be here.